this is when we wrote this question. This was actually it was inspired by there was an economist from the Middle Ages. The name escapes me, but he effectively said in a society you can either have a strong economy with a strong army and all of these things, but have a decadent people, or you could have wise, virtuous people, but have a weak economy in turn. So, what are your thoughts on that? Do we need is it better to have a society that's has a strong economy but has a decadent lifestyle, a weak cultural background, or the vice versa? Opposite.
I don't, I mean, yeah. So, if you're talking about anybody living prior to 200 years ago, prior to when, the economies took off, that is probably how it looks. So I'm not, the quotes you're saying are kind of reminiscent of, Ibn Khaldun, a Middle Eastern philosopher of the Middle Ages, who kind of looked at the cycles that societies went through. Namely, you'd have these societies where they were poor farmers, but they were revolting against somebody, and then they would win. And the first rulers of these societies would be really dedicated to, because they grew up poor, or they grew up under being suppressed conditions, and they would be really dedicated to the people and things like this. And then their children would then take over at some point, and they would have their children would have lived more of a life of luxury, even though they would have had their parents around. And this would be kind of, in a sense, the high watermark for these societies, because you now have a society that's old enough to grow, maybe foster trade, things like this. But then you get their kids, the grandkids of the original people, maybe a couple of generations later, ruling, and they've only had a life of luxury. They're not hard, and they're easy to overtake, essentially, because they lose their guard, things like that. Um, that was not actually a terrible way of describing most of the world prior to about 200 years ago, but I would say we no longer think of those things as mutually exclusive. You can have most of a society that lives in, good amount of wealth. I mean, look at, say the United States or most parts of Europe. They're, most of us are not hardened by any means. We're not warriors. We're not tilling the ground. And there's no reason that this has led to anything but more economic development. A lot of this has to do with technology, and the technologies being available to allow this to happen, to allow for most people to not have to work in agriculture, for instance, which was the lot of most people in world history, especially prior to a couple hundred years ago, and frankly even prior to the last century. Um, so this is something that has changed, and I don't think that any longer remains true. I mean, and, even with military technology these days, it frankly doesn't even matter how big your military is in terms of people. I mean, most of it's technology, right? I mean, even a place like North Korea can be, can be a major threat. Once they gain nuclear weapons. The United States, we have obviously a gigantic military, both in terms of people and budget, but you could cut the amount of people working in the military by quite a bit, and we'd still be a very potent military. So these are things that, the technology has allowed, I think, that equilibrium to shift quite a bit.
Yeah. So it's not so much like a hard man creates strong times create weak men, we create. Okay, and it's more so a technological thing.
I think so. Yeah. But on the other hand, there are things that there are other there's some research, say, recently that's been done, which I find very convincing, that those who lived during the Depression had very different cultural values than those who grew up after the Depression. Especially with respect to things, economists think are important, like saving. People, they even after they became wealthy, if they lived through
It's
the
really
Depression
so
and
true.
remember the hunger and the bread lines and things like that, were much less likely to spend extravagantly. They're much
And the
more
savings
modest
would
in the way.
essentially promote investment spending, which would shift both like the supply and demand to the right in the long run.
Well, yeah, I
According
mean,
to,
but
according to my macro.
but maybe it probably goes the other way, because they're consuming less, for the most
Mm.
part. So but it's more, that type of research is more about thinking about the role that kind of early experiences and kind of that affect cultural values can play later in life as well. And to the degree to which that is what you're describing as, I think that's the 20th century equivalent of being a hard man or a hard woman, right? Is living in poverty even in a wealthy society that does affect the way we think about things. But I think it's a bit different than what was being described certainly in the medieval period.